Today's scripture reading is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verses 17 through 21. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. God alone shall you worship. To God you shall hold fast, and by God's name you shall swear. God is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you in these great and awesome things that your own eyes have seen. Most sermons are aspirational. We don't necessarily figure something out and then impart that wisdom to you. Today may be especially so. Many years ago, I was invited to a gathering out of town at a friend's parents' home. A large group of friends traveled a couple hours to these people's farm. The purpose of this gathering was let's just say that at 8 in the morning in the barn, there was a very large pig. And by early afternoon, that was being made into pork and ham and sausage. They set up an assembly line in their garage. These people had, I think, at least 3 kids. All their kids had brought their friends down there. It was an annual gathering. First time I'd gone, though. So there's this assembly line in the garage, and cuts of pork are being wrapped and labeled. Some of us took some of the pork to a neighbor's house who had a sausage grinder to grind the sausage, which who knew you had to use your hands in addition to the grinder and mix stuff in and get up to your elbows in it. I figured that out. And then that was brought back and wrapped into 1-pound packages. The other thing to know about these people is they were huge KU basketball fans. So this was a basketball day, and so by 3 p.m., the sausage was cooking in the kitchen, and everyone was gathered around this pretty small living room TV to watch the KU game, and they're passing around the sausage for us to eat. So it was quite an education for this city girl, I guess you could say, to experience, and I didn't really miss any of the process from 8 o'clock on, though I can definitely spare you all those details. Although it was fascinating. But what was most memorable about this day was our host, my friend's father, Roman. I had never met Roman before, and I'm not sure if I ever saw him again after that day. And as you can imagine, it was an incredibly busy day, filled with lots of work, lots of guests, and lots of laughter. And he could easily have greeted me and then moved on without another thought, and I wouldn't have been offended. I mean, who was I, But he didn't. He was one of those people who could make you feel like you were the guest of honor, like you were the only person in the room. Even though he'd never met me, he treated me and welcomed me like an old friend. He saw me, this person, oh, there's someone I don't know. And he stopped, and in the midst of this chaotic crowd of people, made me feel like I belonged and that he was thrilled to see me. And I also know he made everyone else there feel the same way. If you were a friend of one of his kids, you were loved and you knew it. So I remember that as a rare, unexpected, out of the ordinary kind of hospitality. So think for a moment about who makes you feel like you belong. Like you're the most important person in the room. Who makes you or sees you, who sees you as worthy of dignity and respect and celebration just because you showed up. We're in week 3 of a sermon series on fruitful practices of resurrection living. I have practiced that many times. And today's fruitful practice is radical hospitality. There are many ways that we can talk about hospitality in the church. We know it's important to have greeters and to wear our name tags and to make sure visitors know where the restrooms are. To have kids' activities and youth programming and small groups where folks can form relationships. And to have coffee, still aspirational on that, but it's coming. Or we could talk about what churches do in the world to serve people and to advocate for justice. We could share lots of shining examples for inspiration, including from our own church. We've worked in many ways to be welcoming, from the open invitation to this table, to the work we do in the community, to the care we show each other. For over 30 years, we've tried to create an open, welcoming, safe space for all. And we might characterize that kind of welcome as unusual or radical, especially 30 years ago. But in our context today, what does radical hospitality refer to? How do we go further? The word radical implies something out of the ordinary, a welcome that exceeds expectations, something revolutionary. When we hear the phrase welcoming the stranger, we often think of immigrants and refugees or people needing homes. There is radical hospitality involved in refugee resettlement programs or housing programs like IHN or Habitat for Humanity. But radical hospitality is not a program or a project. In our context, as people of faith, it's a spiritual practice that involves stepping past the walls we've put up and built around us to keep ourselves comfortable. Most of us enjoy extending a welcome to our family and friends. Extending a welcome to people who are not like us requires something more. And many of us have been conditioned to be cautious, even fearful around strangers. The word for that is xenophobia, from the Greek, combining xenos for stranger, phobia for fear. Contrast that with the biblical word for hospitality, which is philoxenia. Philia is Greek for the type of platonic affection and love between friends and siblings, literally a love of strangers. We know that people are tribal. We find comfort in sameness. Radical hospitality requires us to get out of our comfort zones, to go against our natural inclination to avoid people or situations that are unfamiliar or awkward in order to truly welcome the stranger. The Bible has a lot to say about hospitality. Genesis 18 has been called the original story of hospitality, where Abraham is visited by 3 strangers at the Oaks of Mamre. The strangers are referred to in that scripture as the Lord, and Abraham offers them water and food. He washes their feet. This is the first story where God is welcomed as a stranger, where we learn that extending hospitality to strangers is how we welcome God. And the scriptural examples are numerous. There may be as many. They say that there's all this stuff about the poor in the Bible, which there is. I think there's probably as much about hospitality. The text I read earlier, where God's people are reminded to remember how they were once strangers in the land of Egypt and commanded to welcome the strangers in their midst, is repeated many times. Jesus, of course, is the ultimate example of extending hospitality, from welcoming children in a culture that didn't really value children, to feeding the 5,000, to hanging out with all kinds of unsavory characters who the rest of society kept at arm's length. Jesus is always reaching out and welcoming those on the margins, to the extent that it led to his arrest and execution. Consider his healing of the leper. Lepers had to ring bells as they walked through town so people would know they were approaching. And people shrank away, afraid of contracting the disease. When Jesus encountered the leper, he didn't say, "Don't come any closer until I've healed you." Jesus reached out and touched the leper before he healed him. This is an example of what theologian Miroslav Volf calls the will to embrace. Rather than avoid those we are uncomfortable with, as followers of Jesus, we're called to notice those who are ignored or shunned or treated with contempt. The will to embrace is the first step towards creating a relationship. And that's really what we're talking about. Not simply serving the other, but entering into a relationship of mutuality between equals. Radical hospitality is not doing things for people, but being with people, noticing, stopping, and embracing. When the blind beggar Bartimaeus called out to Jesus as he passed by, Jesus stopped. The crowd tried to keep Bartimaeus quiet, but Jesus heard, stopped and turned, saw, and then restored Bartimaeus' sight. It's about reminding ourselves to see God's face, to see Jesus in everyone we meet, especially those we would rather avoid or ignore. Because Jesus said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." Radical hospitality takes those words seriously. So sometimes that might be as simple as approaching the person you see across the sanctuary every Sunday but have never met. Or during the week, slowing down and truly listening to someone that you think you don't have time for, to someone who makes you uncomfortable in whatever way. Author Richard Beck, in his book Stranger God, Meeting Jesus in Disguise, tells the story of his decision to put this idea into practice. So one Sunday at his church, rather than immediately gravitating to the people he knew, he stopped and he looked around, and his eyes landed on a woman in a wheelchair that he'd never met. So he went over and he introduced himself. Long story short, this was the beginning of a long-term friendship with major implications for his life. She eventually began sitting with his family in church. He began visiting her at the group home where she lived. He took her shopping once a week. And over the years, because of those visits, he became friends with other people in that group home. And today, he says, "I spend less time with middle-class folk and people with PhDs and more time with inmates," because he also visited a prison, "and people with cognitive disabilities. My friendship group has been flipped on its head, all because I approached a stranger to say hello." So Beck's advice to us is to try seeing, stopping, and approaching. Begin with kindness, widen the circle of your affections. Try living in the world as if there were no strangers. The leaked Supreme Court draft on the abortion decision made for a highly emotional week, I imagine, for people on both sides of this issue. COVID isolation and the protocols associated with that are highly emotional. The stark political divides in our nation are emotional. They push people into extreme camps where they often view the other side as immoral, idiotic, or inhumane, which leaves no room for any kind of respectful, let alone fruitful, discussion. And while we can talk in theory about how we see God in everyone, how everyone is worthy of respect and dignity, it is hard to put that into practice with people we truly dislike or feel contempt for because of their beliefs. I don't know of any way to make this easy, but reaching across these divides to extend hospitality seems kind of radical right now. There are organizations that work on promoting civil conversations. There are books, there are theories, but in practice, it seems that it all begins with relationship and with seeing the other as equal in value and dignity. Bridging these political divides in our country may be one of our biggest challenges. I know I rarely seek out conversation with people who I think are on the extreme wrong side, nor does it really occur to me to try to see Jesus in them. On the other hand, there are people I love who hold very different views from mine, and there's grace and room in my life for them. So it must be about the relationships, about seeing people as God sees them. And I wonder what a small, tiny step towards the other side might do. Because this disdain and contempt that we're surrounded by is toxic. Among other things, in preparing for this sermon, I've consulted 2 authors this week who both recommend this relational approach to radical hospitality. And it's actually called The Little Way and came from the writings and life of Saint Therese of Lisieux. She lived in France in the late 1800s. And the idea is that it's our small, ordinary acts of faith, hope, and love that God can use to transform the world. I could present many examples of churches and individuals doing wonderful, radically hospitable things in big ways that make significant changes and differences in their communities, that change people's lives for the better. But also sometimes all those big ideas and examples can be exhausting to hear about when our lives are already filled to the brim with work and raising a family and volunteering and caregiving and all the other things that make our lives so busy. And in our quest to make a big impact, to be a hero, we may miss the opportunity to practice a life of hospitality. It might just fall right through the cracks. To be clear, the little way is not a Band-Aid approach or an excuse to avoid the work for systemic change. It's a practice that allows us to make connections with people in authentic ways, allowing us to rely on God and each other as we work for God's dream for this world. We're actually not called to accomplish great things. We're called to serve God in humility, extending kindness and love in the way of Jesus. We may accomplish great things together, but our call is to the spiritual discipline and practice of radical hospitality, to be with people in simple, faithful, ordinary ways, to do the small, seemingly inconsequential things that can bring about God's kingdom on this earth. May it be so.